Hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar 2030 Horizon of Agri-Food's Future. My name is Tim. I'm a senior analyst here at Lux Research, and I'll be moderating today's session. Presenting today is my colleague, Josh Haslam, Research Director here at Lux Research. Throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have in the questions box on your screen. Time permitting, we will answer all the questions that we can. If your question does not get answered, please do not hesitate to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com and we'll respond. Now, let's hand it over to Josh.
Thanks, Tim. And as you said, today I'm going to be talking about 2030, a horizon of agri-food's future. And this report will be a preamble to a comprehensive analysis we have upcoming in the next month. So please stay tuned for that research and do recognize that there will be a more comprehensive analysis to follow. Now, to start, when we look at how the agri-food industry is changing, there's a lot on the horizon. We have policies, we have promises, we have funding all coming together to create change. And right now, the horizon that is on most people's minds and most companies' minds is 2030, since this is when a lot of these things coincide. So today, what I'm going to do is, as I said, go through this new analysis we've developed and walk you through a section of that to hopefully excite you and help you understand some decision-making processes. So let me dive in. To break up the presentation today, I'm going to start with an overview of the rapidly changing agri-food system. And what I'm going to do is present from the value chain what are the drivers that are actually causing this change. Following building that indication of what is happening, we're going to use a PESTLE analysis to understand why those changes are important. And then from there, and through that, understanding the complexity of challenges, present an analysis where we understand how policies of governments and promises that industry is making align and identify either where those align and where they don't, to understand opportunities and potential challenges that you have coming forward. So with that, let me dive right in. Now, when we look at the agri-food ecosystem, it's accelerating, and it's accelerating independent of whether you are in the production, supply chain, or consumer products portion of the value chain. And as I said, policies and promises as well as funding are really driving this forward. But each of these areas does have some unique drivers that affect it more so than others. And that's what I'm going to do in this section, bring forward the leading 4 drivers in each of these portions of the value chain. So let's start off with production sources. When we think of agriculture production, weather and climate is by far one of the most critical aspects of change and uncertainty. And how weather and climate affect the world and affect our growing operations often is going to affect regional policy shifts, right? Everything from pesticide use to water use. But that's not where production ends. Production has also begun through biosynthesis production. We see a great uptick in the contribution of biosynthesis to industries, and in some cases, biosynthesis is directly related to agriculture production through feedstock availability, but also there are new examples of alternative feedstocks that perhaps don't rely on our classical agriculture production. Lastly, we need to think about where growth of our production will be in the future. And right now, that remains focused in low-income and emerging nations as they make decisions on how to increase their economic well-being, as well as export and think about imports as well. So these are the key 4 drivers affecting production sources. If we move up the value chain to the supply chain, we see, and I'm sure we're all feeling this, supply disruption is a norm. And as supply disruptions become this norm, government reach is extending further into industry. It's extending into industry to to impact and preferably stabilize how our supply chains function, and perhaps even improve and standardize how we monitor them. And that, as a part of this function, is where Scope 3 matters. When we think about the agri-food ecosystem, most of our emissions are often very much centered around Scope 3. And as a result, and more so than other areas, government reach is also extending into this sector, and we see that impacting the supply chain. Lastly, we have worker shortages. As we think about the cost to produce, the predictability of our workforce, we see that that's also been disrupted, and as a result is causing a lot of shifts in the way we need to think about the future of how we move products within the supply chain. Lastly, as we move towards the consumer, we see four different things. First and foremost, health and outcomes matter to consumers today. Consumers are trying to behave more preventative, and as a result, demand products that give predictable and beneficial results to health. In addition, choice is expanding to consumers. Everything from proteins to oils, right? We have greater diversity of choices, and we only see that diversity is going to expand in the future. And this means that businesses are looking to sustainably distinguish themselves through sustainability, which is really important. It means that all of the innovations around sustainability are going to be imperatives for businesses to understand and understand how to implement. And they need to do this in the face of the price of goods rising, which is an incredible challenge and will appear to remain a challenge moving forward for some time. So that provides you with an overview of what is happening. What are the maybe top four challenges and drivers you need to overcome across the value chain for agri-food? But why are these important? And that's why I want to talk about this PESTLE analysis that we've put together. And so for those unaware, PESTLE analysis allows you to understand externalities affecting your industry and includes political, economic, social, technology, legal, and environment components. But for this presentation today, I'm going to mix up the letters a little bit here, mix up the order so that you can understand how you should think about the flow of these different externalities and how they impact your decision making. We're going to start by understanding the environment and how environment impacts affect the overall perception of our production systems. We're then going to look into social and how consumers make choices with their dollar, and that often relates to how things are made and also how they perceive the outcomes they want. From there, policies often align with environment and consumer behavior, and we're going to look at the policies that are impacting the agri-food ecosystem, then going to look at the impact of those, particularly on economic well-being, which then drives political decisions as governments look to, as I said before, stabilize supply chains, improve traceability, and then we have technology. Now, technology provides the avenue where you can overcome the hurdles, the challenges, and perhaps even create opportunities, which is all of our goals when we think about the opportunity around sustainability and the growth of the agri-food system. So let's dive right in. Again, first and foremost, I want to bring up environmental impact as where for agri-food, risk starts and ends here. With weather and climate, the one thing we've seen is that climate impacts are consistently occurring earlier in every new projection we see. So every time you see a projection, think to yourself, I should be prepared before this. And you can see that in the EU, for example. 44% of the EU's agriculture imports are highly vulnerable to drought. This is one of the leading changes that's being created as a result of weather and climate change on a regional basis. And as a result here, you can see that it puts our agri-food system at risk. In addition, as I said before, where weather and climate is impacting often at the production stage, we also see that businesses, even on the consumer side, are trying to sustainably distinguish themselves. Land use change has affected a third of the global land area, and that's happened in just 6 decades. And as a result, we're seeing companies make decisions around things like deforestation. A lot of our supply chains are very unlikely to be including much products that are produced in alignment in any way with deforestation in the future. And this is a major change that we see moving forward, particularly in regions like Asia and South America. Now, if we move up a little bit, we see that, again, consumers are integrating new choice in their lives when we think about the social aspect of our PESTLE. And as I said before, first and foremost, choice expands. And while this is a driver of consumer area, you can see that's connected to the supply chain. For instance, diversity of protein sources is linked to improved health, and having those protein sources available is something that affects both production and supply chain. And we actually see governments also beginning to align here. Canada actually includes a diversity of proteins now in their new food plate. In addition, however, we see that choice doesn't always align with the perception of quality. There's a lot of push for quality to be improved and to actually realize the value and revenue increases from that improved quality. However, consumers still have a hard time understanding how to connect the dots. They think maybe only visually for quality, not necessarily the inherent quality of a product. And as a result, this aligns directly with the next point, which is health and outcomes matter. It's not enough now to just say that something has quality. You need to demonstrate that it does. And this is really important as consumers look to overcome the connection between things like gut, health, and immunity, which signifies a demand to overcome chronic illnesses through the agri-food ecosystem. And on top of that, it's not just about your own inherent well-being, it's also about the environment around you. Food choices are increasingly based on environmental impact and the inherent quality. And so we'll see this begin to become part of those decisions more and more as consumers look to make choices that they feel are good for their well-being as well as sustainability. Now, when we look at policy that's resulting from those environment and social shifts, what we see is that regional policy shifts are evident just in the last several years. We have things like food labeling shifting drastically. We have gene editing actually moving forward, right? The UK has now decided to lax those regulations and make new ones. EU seems primed to follow suit. And in addition, we're seeing, as I said before, government reach extending. The US Department of Agriculture recently announced a very sizable framework to shore up the food system. And they're not alone. Other governments are also taking interest in trying to develop policy that allows them to protect their resources and imports. In addition, government is extending into the emissions debate, particularly beginning to fall into the Scope 3 emissions debate, whether that's managing voluntary carbon markets as far as standardizing how communication is made, or as far as creating necessary policy that requires Scope 3 emissions. Now, on the economic side, what is this causing? Well, again, as we said, supply chain disruption is the norm. Even though we're trying to overcome the challenges, disruption is still evident across the world. And as a result, we have the cost of essential food items increasing on 10% on average. That's significant. Everything from fats and oils to fresh fruits to seafood are all highly impacted by this. And as a result of those rising costs, we see that companies are racing to produce the least for the highest price. And this is a challenge, right? It's a challenge to maintain revenue under these difficult times. However, if you think about this, with rising costs comes the ability to implement technology, because those costs now align. And this very well may set the stage to establish the next wave of mechanization in a lot of our food production processes. So everything we have here is on the consumer side for rising costs, as well as the supply disruption being a norm and really affecting supply chain and everything downstream as well. Now, if we move into politics, we see that, again, growth and focus is on low income and emerging nations. This is where we face a lot of challenges. The world is on the brink of food crisis in many portions of the world, and food is really a tool for humanitarian assistance as well as geopolitical stabilization. We see lots of countries making negotiations with the resources that they have that are important to them. So, this is becoming a major challenge and also a major impact across the industry. As I said before, scope 3 on top of this matters, and we see more aggressive states and nations positioning themselves to reduce the impacts of scope 3. So the California Senate has recently passed a bill requiring large companies to report scope 3 emissions. In addition, science-based targets are pervading both governments as well as industry, and we expect those to be very important towards the standardization of what it means to monitor and manage scope 3 emissions moving forward across the agri-food supply chain. And so what does all this mean for technology, especially around sustainability? Well, as I said, funding continues to fall into the agri-food ecosystem, and it's allowing for rapid advancement of innovations. As I said before, biosynthesis is a new form of production that we now have available, and we are being able to overcome the hurdles and achieve scalability faster than we thought as a result of the funding we're seeing. However, there are still bottlenecks out there, right? There's a lot of infrastructure that's still required to keep the pace with the growth of innovation for biosynthesis. And if we think about the supply chain, we have worker shortages that still haven't been overcome. The cost of workers and their unpredictability as a result of continued effects of COVID-19 are continuing to drive investment in automation, because this technology is required, at least in some degree, to overcome and provide challenges and to provide ways to have flexibility to overcome the challenges of these worker shortages. So really what we have is a lot of factors that affect agri-food in a real way, and there's a real need for innovation around sustainability to come through and make those changes. So as I said before, I reshuffled the letters here, and you see that they spell out slept, and I think this is fortuitous in that it's really important that individuals and companies themselves don't fall asleep at this juncture. It's really important to continue to move forward, but to move forward carefully because of the complexity of challenges and drivers that we're facing. And this complexity breeds paradoxes that challenge your decision making. For instance, we can take the example of a demand for health outcomes. Consumers want this. They want reliable preventative wellness products, and those offer a significant opportunity. However, how do you position yourself in the face of rising product costs? If consumers are struggling to make decisions under tightening budgets as all of their products are increasing in price, will they pay for these high value goods? Well, in order to do this and make decisions here, you need a litmus test to identify these state changes, these directional shifts, and these industry gaps across the value chain. And therefore, you'd be able to position your innovation around sustainability for future success. And that's exactly what I want to talk about now. A methodology to understand how policy and promises align. And as I said, when you look at that PESTLE analysis, the first two things in it are the environment and social. Those two things drive policy. And that is the main reason why we're focusing on the alignment of policy promise now, because they begin that cascade of events. And so this is where to look to really understand what's likely to happen. And our goal today is to fill in the following diagram. So on the timeline, on the x-axis, we have impacts today, in the next 3 years, and the next 8 years, all towards this horizon of 2030. And then if we look at the policy and promise alignment, what we're looking at here is, does the momentum in recent policy promulgation and the promises of companies along this horizon match, or do they not? And so in order to do this, what we set out to do is score policy and promises in each component of a simplified value chain, starting with production source, supply chain, and then consumer products. Once we have those for each, we can then look forward and do an alignment analysis. Now, it's not enough just to think about the alignment of each of these. It's really important, as I said, to think about sustainability, because technologies that affect sustainability are the ones really driving change across the agri-food system. So on top of this, what we did is look at a lot of the companies out there and what their promises are, as well as policies. And we identified 12 archetypal sustainability goals, everything from human welfare and regenerative agriculture to virgin plastic use and CO2 reduction. And what we did is look at many of the leading companies in each portion of the value chain, as well as policies across the Americas, EU, and Asia, and identify the impact and longevity of those, each of those policies or promises, and align them with one of the 12 archetypal sustainability goals that you see here. And what we get from that is the following. And I want to start by looking at the promises. And I think if you look on the right here, red color indicates a low impact, yellow a medium, and green a high. And so when we think about these, what we see right off the bat is that the supply chain is creating a lot of momentum behind scalability and momentum. It has more green, more yellow, less red. That's the quick and easy way to look at this figure. On top of that, we see that there is one single layer of our sustainability areas, CO2 reduction, that is evident and has momentum across all portions of the value chain. That's also good news. Lastly, as far as a key takeaway from this figure goes, is we see that on the ends of the value chain, there perhaps are different focuses. We can look at source production, and we see three real focuses that are associated with promises that company making: regenerative agriculture, product stewardship, and CO2 reduction. On consumer products, we see a bit more diverse look, but you can see that CO2 reduction through recycling, reuse, consumer packaging, as well as water use tend to be the main areas focused on, and then there's a diversity of areas that have some degree of focus. If we look at the policy, we see a different story come out. First and foremost, it's very evident that across the value chain, CO2 reduction, renewable energy, and waste management are all important policy goals across nations. This isn't that surprising. However, along with this, we see two areas that have either two boxes with green or yellow in them. One is human welfare. So human welfare remains a really important policy driver for things like labeling strategies, for instance. And land use is a second important area of policy. I already brought up examples of deforestation and sustainable agriculture practices. So taken individually, these have some important key takeaways, but as I said, the most important thing is identifying where these align and where they don't, because through that, you'll be able to develop a strategy around sustainability. So let's see, let's fill in this figure. And if you fill in the figure, you can see, but I want to break this down by what's important to think about today, in the next 3 years, and the next 8 years. So let's start here with today. Well, where do we see policy and promise aligning? Two areas are kind of easy wins. One is human welfare, and the other is renewable energy. These two areas have both a large number of promises companies are making, as well as policies that are being implemented and changed in the near term. Now, water use and stewardship is an important area here, but the connection between recent policy change and the promises company makes, they don't really align. There's a lot of policies that have been around for quite some time that continue to impact water use, and then the promises companies are making are really dependent on challenges on a regional basis of that water availability. And so, you know, when you think about water use, it's going to be more of a case-by-case basis as far as how you think about interacting here. If we look in the middle over the next 3 years, so this midterm projection, we see a larger number of contributors. right off the bat, sustainable sourcing is at the highest. Lots of policies around sourcing, lots of promises around sourcing, and you see right below that is deforestation. Deforestation is probably one of the most important contributors today to sustainable sourcing. Below that, we have recycling, reuse, and compostable packaging remains an incredible alignment, and then animal welfare as well. And these are indeed affecting technology adoption and continuing to cause changes in our food system as we think about how choice is expanding. For instance, dairy alternatives would be one great example. And lastly, we have virgin plastic use. So for the supply chain itself, we see a little bit less alignment between policy and promises. However, if you were to move upstream in the value chain to consumer, virgin plastics have a much more important impact there. What about in the long term? Where should you be moving yourself towards that 2030 in the long term? Well, there's a couple really interesting areas. One is we see waste management and CO2 reduction at the top here. So what does it mean to be high policy and promise alignment, but have a long timeline? Well, it means that policies are under the way, but they aren't quite ready to make a sizable impact. There's a lot of small steps that need to happen before anything that affects industry will be evident, but you can prepare for those changes. And so this goes for waste management and thinking about residuals as well as CO2 reduction. The same goes for regenerative agriculture. While there's a lot of momentum for regenerative agriculture, as far as policy goes, there's a bit less. There's a lot around sustainability, but as far as monitoring how those practices improve land over time, policy is not necessarily as well aligned. And then the same goes for product stewardship. Here, there's a lot of promises being made, but as far as policy impacting product stewardship, we don't necessarily see that. So industry taking the lead there. Now, if you are to take this figure and think about what are the sure bets to move forward, I think two come forward, right? In the short term, obviously renewable energy has to be a part of your decarbonization goals. So that's the easy one. Perhaps one that's a little more difficult and long-term to think about is thinking about managing waste and the opportunities there. So there's going to be many residual opportunities moving forward based on this analysis. We see the regulations coming forward around lots of different nations in Asia, as well as other developed regions, that managing waste will create significant opportunities, and it's likely that infrastructure and government programs will be established to improve that incentivization and create a structure that makes that more attractive. But as I said, this is something that's likely mid or long term. So what's an example of this residual opportunities? Well, if we look at a company, not PLA, we see that they're developing packaging solutions from seaweed. So this is a non-classical feedstock from agriculture, but one that is growing in interest. Cultivation of macroalgae is very interesting. It has the potential to be sustainable and has the potential to really reduce impacts overall. Now, in the short term, their water use is not much of an impact here. Some of the other categories in that today factor aren't necessarily aligned. However, if you look in the midterm and the long term, we see lots of alignment. First and foremost, we see reuse, recycling, compostability being directly aligned with Not PLA's strategy of developing packaging from seaweed that is compostable. We also see sustainable sourcing. As I said, the feedstock for this is potentially from a sustainable source that is macroalgae from the ocean. Lastly, we have virgin plastic use. So Not PLA is trying to overcome virgin plastic use and provide a product that can provide not only packages, but also plastic-like coatings. And then lastly, if we look at that long-term opportunity, right, as waste management and residual opportunities improve, and as for instance, the macroalgae industry grows, there might be waste there that can be included into Not PLA's strategy. And all of this aligns with CO2 reduction overall, since petrochemicals would no longer be applied in the making of plastic. So what's the reality? Well, Not PLA has recently raised 11 million and is likely to reach the market in the next few years. And that's really important. That aligns directly with the plan we set forward here. You see, strong midterm contributor. If it gets products in the next few years, it will be penetrating the market, and then will align with continued policies around waste management and CO2 reduction to make it more attractive in the coming future. So this is a great example of how you can use this type of strategy, combine it with technologies you're interested in to understand how they fit into likelihood of change that you would foresee in different sectors of the value chain. So with that, I want to leave you with some key takeaways today. First and foremost, I brought up the complexity of drivers. Yes, there are drivers that maybe originate in different sectors of the value chain. However, as you saw from the PESTLE, most of these drivers are interacting with at least one other. And the example I shared today was simplified. So it's actually much more complex than that. That interaction creates paradoxes that can really challenge your decision making. So you need some form of a litmus test, right, to assess what that horizon looks like towards 2030 and even beyond, so you can make better decisions. And that is why we developed this framework and methodology. And what I presented for you is that the supply chain players and end position players, so while supply chain is driving a lot of the momentum, it will be really important that the end position players also align with the supply chain in order to accelerate how we move forward with shifting policy as an industry together. And I think this is critical to consider. And as you think about this, you can think about where policies and promises align, and especially where strong promises from industry align. These are going to be the focal points of change to center your sustainability strategy behind. And just one final point. I'm talking a lot about where policy and promises align, but don't forget, there's another way to think about this, and that's to identify gaps and identify players that can fill in those gaps. So if you're more interested in this, please do reach out and contact us. We'd be happy to talk more. And with that, I thank you all for listening today.
Thank you, Josh, for sharing an overview of Agrifood's future. Thank you very much. We'll now be taking questions. You can still type questions in the questions box. If we do not get to your question on this call, someone from Lux will be in touch after the webinar. So let me take the first question, Josh. Like you did mention about recycling and waste valorization. So what type of waste streams should be considered?
Yeah, well, I think this is I think just focusing on single waste streams probably isn't the best way to move about. I think the more important part of this is thinking about how a waste stream fits into processes. And that's probably the better way to think about your decisions around choosing a feedstock, let's say. And so, for instance, we'll keep talking about not PLA, and then I'll bring another example here. So, where would not PLA have a great opportunity? Well, it will be in a region either that has accessibility to macroalgae or in a region where macroalgae industry itself is being developed further. And one of the key areas there is actually in Asia. So, not PLA has an interesting opportunity to utilize waste from that. Another example is developing feedstocks that produce something complementary, or utilizing feedstocks that are complementary with existing process. An example of that in agriculture is in vertical agriculture or indoor agriculture systems. So for instance, tomato production. In tomato production, we produce this high value fruit, but then have a lot of plant biomass left over. And the question is, what do you do with that waste material? Well, you can get rid of it, you can compost it, you can burn it, but can you make something else out of it that's also valuable? And what we're seeing some companies do now is create synergistic opportunities. So taking that plant biomass that's likely a predictable substrate and growing things like fungi, another high value fresh food that can work with the system you're working in. So I think those are opportunities. We're seeing that play out in Singapore, for example.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you very much. We have a couple more questions, but because of the time constraint, we'll not be in a position to take those questions, but we'll be getting back to you. So please email us your questions. We'll respond to you soon. So thank you, Josh. That concludes our webinar for today. The slide presentation and recording from this webinar will be sent to all attendees via email today. After leaving the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a survey on today's presentation. We would appreciate any feedback you may have to help inform and improve for future webinars. Take a moment and check out our upcoming webinars. Thank you very much for joining us and have a great day.
Thanks all.